There is a particular kind of satisfaction that is not about anger and not about cruelty, and is entirely about patience and preparation and the willingness to let a situation develop to its natural conclusion without interfering. I had been gardening seriously for 11 years by the time this happened, and I had learned that the best things in a garden are the things you do not rush. You plant, you tend, you wait, you let the plant do what the plant does. The Carolina Reaper, in particular, is not a pepper you can hurry. It takes its time. It grows through summer looking almost identical to a dozen other pepper varieties, and then it ripens, and everything about it announces exactly what it is to anyone who knows what they are looking at. My neighbor did not know what she was looking at. That was the whole thing, really. She did not know what she was looking at, and she did not ask, and she did not stop, and she helped herself week after week. And then one week the reapers came in, and she helped herself to those too, and that was the last week she ever came into my garden uninvited. My name is Helen Marsh. I am 56 years old, and I live at 7 Clover Hill Road in Westfield, Massachusetts, in a neighborhood called Foxglove Commons that has about 60 homes and a HOA that I have generally gotten along with reasonably well, with some exceptions that I will mention as they become relevant. I'm a retired high school biology teacher, and I grow things with the same enthusiasm and rigor that I once brought to teaching cellular respiration to teenagers who would have preferred to be anywhere else. My garden is my serious project. I have a kitchen garden with herbs and vegetables, a perennial border that I have been developing for 8 years, a small orchard with 4 apple trees and 2 pear trees, and my pepper section, which is the part of this story. The pepper section started as a practical matter. I enjoy cooking, and I cook a lot of food from cuisines that use fresh chilies, and buying decent fresh chilies in western Massachusetts is not always straightforward depending on the variety. So I started growing my own. Each year I expanded the variety list. By the time this story takes place, I had 17 varieties growing in a raised bed section in the side yard, ranging from mild Anaheim peppers through medium serranos and jalapenos, up through hotter habaneros and Scotch bonnets, and at the extreme end, 3 Carolina Reaper plants that I had started from seed the previous February. The Carolina Reaper, if you are not familiar with it, holds or has held the Guinness World Record for the hottest pepper on Earth. Its Scoville heat rating is in the range of 1.5 to 2.2 million Scoville heat units, depending on the specific fruit and growing conditions. For context, a jalapeno runs between 2,500 and 8,000 Scoville units. A habanero runs between 100,000 and 350,000. The Carolina Reaper is a categorically different experience from any of those. It is not a pepper that you eat accidentally or casually. It is a pepper that experienced chili enthusiasts approach with deliberate preparation and respect, and that uninformed people who mistake it for something milder encounter with consequences that are memorable, immediate, and deeply unpleasant. My neighbor Patricia Odom lived at 9 Clover Hill Road, directly next to me with a shared property line along my side yard where the pepper bed was located. Patricia was 63, recently retired from a dental office manager position, and had during her retirement developed a habit of spending a great deal of time in her own side yard garden, which backed up to mine with only a low ornamental border between them. The low border was aesthetic, not functional. It was about 14 inches of brick edging with some decorative plantings. It did not constitute a barrier of any kind. Patricia and I had gotten along reasonably well for the 4 years we had been neighbors. She was pleasant in a surface-level way. We waved, we occasionally spoke over the fence about weather and garden topics, and I had not had any serious difficulty with her. In late June of the summer in question, I noticed that my pepper plants looked like they were producing less than I expected. Not dramatically, not immediately, obviously, but the yield from my weekly harvest walks was lower than I was tracking it against my garden journal. I grow carefully and I document carefully because I am a biologist and documentation is how I understand what is happening. My journal had expected ranges for each variety based on prior years and the plant's appearance that season, and the actual harvest was running below range. I looked more carefully. The plants were healthy. No disease, no pest pressure beyond the usual, no stress indicators. The fruit was setting normally, but when I walked the bed on harvest day, there was less ripe fruit than I expected to find based on what I had seen the day before. I set up my phone on the kitchen windowsill. The window overlooked the side yard and the pepper bed. I angled it to capture the side yard and pressed record before I left for my Tuesday morning walk, which was a standing commitment that took me out of the house for about 90 minutes between 7:30 and 9. When I came home and reviewed the footage, I watched Patricia Odom walk through the gap in the ornamental border and move along my pepper bed with the ease and familiarity of someone who had done this before. She picked peppers with the casual selectiveness of someone browsing a farmer's market. She took jalapenos, she took a handful of serranos, she took 2 of the habaneros I had been watching ripen, and she took several other fruits I could not identify precisely from the camera angle. She was in my garden for about 6 minutes. She looked around once while she was there, a brief check toward the street, not toward my house. I watched this footage 3 times. I did not knock on her door. I did not post the video publicly. I did not call the HOA, not yet. What I did was think carefully about what I knew and what I wanted to do about it. Patricia had been taking my peppers. Based on the discrepancy in my harvest records and the footage I had just captured, she had probably been doing it for at least 3 or 4 weeks. She was taking mild to moderate heat peppers, jalapenos, serranos, habaneros, and she was doing it casually, which meant she had convinced herself that what she was doing was not a serious thing. I also thought about what was in my pepper bed that she had not yet encountered. The 3 Carolina Reaper plants were positioned at the far end of the bed, closest to my house and furthest from the ornamental border where Patricia entered. They were not yet ripe. In late June in Massachusetts. Carolina Reapers are still green and are still developing the distinctive wrinkled skin and small scorpion-like tail that makes them visually identifiable to experienced pepper growers. A person who was not familiar with pepper varieties would see green fruits on a plant and not necessarily know what they were looking at. I estimated, based on the plant's stage of development, that the reapers would begin to ripen in approximately 4 to 6 weeks. They would turn from green to orange and then to a deep red, and the distinctive shape would become more pronounced as they matured. I decided to wait. This decision requires some explanation because it is the decision that people ask me about most when I tell this story, and I want to be honest about my thinking. I was not planning to harm Patricia. I was not setting a trap designed to cause serious injury. I was making a choice to let a natural process continue to its natural conclusion, which was that eventually the peppers at the far end of my bed would ripen and Patricia, who was helping herself without asking and without apparently doing any research about what she was taking, would have an experience. That experience would be her own consequence. I had not misrepresented anything to her, had not lured her, had not manipulated the situation. She was taking peppers from my garden without permission. I was tending my garden as I always had. What happened when she helped herself to a reaper was between her and her own choices. I did, in the weeks that followed, add a small sign to the pepper bed. It said, in clear printed text on a laminated card attached to a garden stake, "Caution, mixed VAITIES, including SUPIHOT peppers, not for casual consumption." I placed it at the border end of the bed, near where Patricia entered, where it was clearly visible from the gap in the ornamental border. I documented the sign's installation with a photograph showing its placement and the date. I continued filming my Tuesday morning walks on my kitchen camera. Patricia came back the following Tuesday. She walked past the sign. She glanced at it. She kept going and picked jalapenos and serranos and another habanero. She left. I added the footage to my documentation folder. She came back the Tuesday after that. Same pattern, walked past the sign, picked from the bed, left. The 3rd Tuesday after I put up the sign, 5 weeks into my surveillance and documentation, the Carolina Reapers were beginning to turn. The outer skin had shifted from solid green to greenish-orange with some red patches on the most mature fruits. The characteristic wrinkled texture was pronounced. The small scorpion-like tail on each pepper was clearly visible. To me, looking at those plants, they were unmistakably reapers. To someone without pepper knowledge, they were red-orange peppers, unusual looking but not obviously different in category from the habaneros Patricia had been taking. I filmed my Tuesday departure that week as usual. I came back 90 minutes later and reviewed the footage. Patricia had come into the garden. She had moved along the bed. She had picked jalapenos and serranos. She had reached the far end of the bed, near the Reaper plants, where the most mature fruits were now predominantly red-orange. I watched her examine one Reaper for a moment, turning it in her hand. Then she picked 4 of them. She put them in her basket with the other peppers and walked back through the gap in the ornamental border. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and waited. I did not have to wait long. Part 2. I was in my kitchen at about 5:30 that evening, making dinner, when I heard something from next door. Not a scream. Patricia was not a screaming type, or at least she was not by nature, although nature was about to be tested. It was more of a sound that began as an exclamation and then evolved, over about 30 seconds, into something that combined distress and disbelief in roughly equal measure. I turned down the stove and listened. There were more sounds. There was the sound of running water, which I recognized from the direction as her kitchen sink. There was a brief telephone conversation, the words indistinct through the wall, but the tone clearly urgent. There was a period of sustained vocal expression of discomfort that I will describe as extended and genuine. I continued making my dinner. At 7:15, my doorbell rang. I opened the door. Patricia was standing on my front porch. Her face was red, not in a skin reaction way, but in the way of someone who has been crying and is still managing some residual inflammation. Her eyes were watery. She was holding a glass of milk, which told me someone had given her the correct emergency advice, and she had a small container in her other hand that I recognized as one of the ripe Reapers she had picked that afternoon. She said, "Helen, what is this?" I looked at the pepper. I said, "That is a Carolina Reaper. It is the hottest pepper variety in the world. Do you need any help?" She said, "I made dinner. I put 3 of those in my dinner." I said, "I recommend milk or other dairy, which it looks like someone has already suggested. Bread helps absorb the capsaicin. Do not drink water, it spreads it." She said, "Why do you have those?" I said, "I grow 17 varieties of peppers. The Carolina Reapers are for specific recipes that require extreme heat, used in very small quantities. They are not for general consumption." She looked at me. She said, "There was a sign." I said, "Yes, there was a sign." We looked at each other. She said, "I didn't think it was serious." I said, "The sign said super hot peppers." She said, "I thought it was a general gardening thing. I didn't think." She stopped. She looked at the pepper in her hand. She looked at me. The full sequence of what had happened was assembling itself in her expression: the weeks of taking peppers without asking, the sign she had walked past 3 times, the Reaper in her hand, the dinner she had made, the milk glass. She said, "Helen, did you know I was taking your peppers?" It was a genuine question, not accusatory, more like someone asking for confirmation of a map they had been reading wrong. I said, "I have security camera footage from the past 6 weeks showing you taking peppers from my bed on Tuesday mornings. I also have a record of the harvest discrepancy going back to late June." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, I thought we had that kind of neighborly arrangement, like the border between our gardens was just, I didn't realize." I said, "Patricia, you were taking peppers from my garden without asking. You walked past a sign that said the bed contains super hot peppers. I am not angry with you, but I want to be clear about what happened." She looked at the milk glass. She said, "I still have most of this Reaper in my stomach." I said, "Yes." "Are you having any breathing difficulty or severe throat swelling?" She said, "No, it is just very active." I said, "That is normal. The capsaicin will metabolize. Keep drinking dairy. Avoid water. If anything becomes alarming, call me immediately and we can get you medical help. But what you're describing sounds like a normal response to extreme capsaicin consumption." She nodded. She said, I have never experienced anything like this in my life. I said, most people have not. She stood on my porch for another moment, managing several things at once. She said, I owe you an apology. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry for taking your peppers, for not asking for. She gestured at the reaper with the milk glass. I said, the sign was there. I want to be clear about that. She said, I know it was. She went home. I heard her kitchen activity for another 2 hours, which sounded like sustained dairy consumption and the kind of packing that capsaicin-mediated distress produces. At 9 p.m. things were quieter. The following morning, she knocked on my door with a small gift, a jar of preserves from a farm stand she liked, and a handwritten card that said she was sorry and she would not do it again, and she hoped we could remain good neighbors. I appreciated the card. I also had 6 weeks of camera footage and a documented harvest record and a sign with a date-stamped installation photo and the reaper she had brought to my door that I had photographed with her hand in frame. I had not yet decided what to do with all of that. What made the decision for me was a conversation I had 2 days later with a woman named Donna Farris, who lived 3 houses down and who grew a vegetable garden in her backyard, and who told me, over a chance conversation at the end of her driveway, that she had noticed her zucchini were coming in lower than expected this season, and she wondered if she had a squash vine borer problem. I said, have you checked if anyone is picking them before you get to them? She looked at me. She said, what? I said, I had a harvest discrepancy issue this season too. It turned out someone was coming into my garden. Donna looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, Patricia Odom once told me she liked to walk the neighborhood gardens in the mornings for inspiration. I went home and thought about that phrase, walk the neighborhood gardens for inspiration. That was a particular framing. It was the framing of someone who had developed a self-narrative in which taking from other people's gardens was a kind of neighborly appreciation rather than theft. I went back through my camera footage. On one of the Tuesdays I had not been specifically watching, the camera had captured not just Patricia, but also a partial view of her departing toward Donna's end of the street rather than straight back to her house. I called Donna back and asked her to check her camera footage if she had any. She had a front door camera. The footage she found showed Patricia walking past Donna's front fence on a Tuesday morning during the weeks in question, carrying her garden basket. Donna's backyard was accessible from a side gate that she told me she did not always lock because she was in and out of it throughout the day. The gate faced the side street, not the front, and was not visible on her front camera. But the basket in Patricia's hands leaving in the direction of Donna's house, and then the footage of Patricia returning past Donna's fence 15 minutes later with a fuller basket was at minimum suggestive. I talked to 2 other gardeners in the neighborhood that week. One had noticed lower herb production than expected. One had a missing pumpkin that she had attributed to wildlife. I put together a quiet and careful documentation package, my own footage and records, Donna's footage, the 3 other gardeners' accounts written up as brief factual statements about what they had noticed and when, the sign photos, the harvest records, the reaper Patricia had brought to my door with my photograph of it. I did not go to the HOA first. I went to Patricia. I called her and asked her to come over. She came, with the somewhat uncertain energy of someone who was not sure what kind of conversation was coming, but had a sense it was not casual. We sat at my kitchen table, and I laid out the documentation in the order I had assembled it. I said, Patricia, I want to show you something before I decide what to do with it. She looked at the folder, she looked at me, she sat down. I walked her through it, my footage, my harvest records, the sign, Donna's footage, the other neighbors' accounts. I did it the way I would have organized a biology unit, clearly, sequentially, with evidence at each step supporting the conclusion. No drama, no anger, just the documentation. When I finished, she was looking at the kitchen table. She said, after a long moment, how many gardens? I said, I have accounts from 4 including mine. There may be others. She said, I told myself it was neighborly. I told myself nobody minded. I told myself. She stopped. She was working through something that was not comfortable to work through. She said, I stole from my neighbors. I said, yes. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, what are you going to do? I said, that depends on you. I want 4 things. I want you to visit each of the gardeners whose accounts are in that folder and apologize to them directly. I want you to ask each of them if there are specific harvests they remember you taking so that you can make restitution, which might mean buying them produce or bringing seedlings or whatever they feel is appropriate. I want you to write a letter to the HOA yourself, not from me, acknowledging what you did and asking that it be noted, because the HOA should know and you should be the one to tell them. And I want you to stop. She said, and if I do those things? I said, then the folder stays in my files as documentation, but I do not submit it to the HOA or to the police. What you did was theft. The pepper incident was a consequence of your own choices, not something I caused. I put up a sign. She said, you put up a sign. I said, I put up a sign. She looked at the table again, then she looked up. She said, the reaper, you knew they were ripening. I said, I tend my garden, Patricia. Everything in it is tended. She considered this for a moment and then said something that surprised me. She said, that's fair. She did all 4 things I asked. She apologized to Donna in person and to the other 2 gardeners. She brought seedlings to each one as restitution, which she had asked them about and they had said was the right form. She wrote the HOA letter. I saw a copy before she sent it. She had asked if I wanted to review it, and it was honest and complete and said exactly what had happened without minimizing. The HOA noted it in the meeting minutes as a resolved neighbor matter. The board president, a man named Gregory Holt, who had a sensible approach to most things, told me afterward that it was the first time in his tenure that a resident had voluntarily disclosed a violation and handled the restitution themselves before any complaint was filed, and that the outcome was, in his view, exactly what a community should look like when things go wrong. I thought about that. Patricia and I are still neighbors. We are not closer than we were before, but the relationship has a different quality, more honest, more careful, the kind of thing that happens when people have been through something together and both know exactly what happened and have decided to proceed from there. She grows her own peppers now. She asked me last spring for advice on what varieties to start with, and I gave her a list that began with Sweet Bells and Anaheims and did not include anything with a tail. She did ask once, with the kind of directness that comes from having nothing left to be embarrassed about, was the sign warning me or was it something else? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, it was a legitimate safety warning for my pepper bed. What you chose to do after seeing it was your own decision. She nodded slowly. She said, do you grow the reapers again this year? I said, I do, far end of the bed. She said, I'll remember that. I said, I imagine you will. My garden journal this season shows harvest numbers that match my projections precisely. Every jalapeno, every serrano, every habanero, and every Carolina Reaper accounted for. I pick them myself on Tuesday mornings when I get back from my walk, the same walk I have always taken, the same kitchen window with the same view of the side yard when I leave and when I return. The reapers are ripening now, the way they always do, in their own time, deeper red each morning, those characteristic tails curling slightly in the late summer heat. I use them sparingly, in small quantities, in recipes that can handle what they bring. They are not casual peppers. They are not for everyone. They know exactly what they are. Thumbnail text.